In this Lords of the Fallen video, I'm going to be showing you my Lord of Cinder build, which is kind of like a Fire Knight-ish build, if you will. It's kind of like a Knight archetype, but it has some fire elements to it. Uses sword and shield, crossbow, and has some really good things going for it. So taking a look at the weapon that I'm using for this build, I'm using the Proselyte sword, which drops from the Proselyte enemies of the game. There's one of these very early on in the game in Abandoned Red Cops, and then one outside Skyrest Bridge as well. This can be farmed. It can take a while to get one of these, and you don't absolutely have to have one of these for this build, but there are a few things that I like about it. First of all, it has only strength scaling and only strength requirements, meaning that you can just dump points into strength in order to meet the requirements for this weapon and to get damage out of it. And you don't have to worry about, meeting some like 13 or 10 or 12 agility requirement, wasting points there. Secondly, another thing that I like is that this has physical and fire damage, but only requires strength scaling. There's no Inferno scaling, so again, all your points can go into strength, which is nice. And it also has burning buildup, meaning that it's going to apply burning if you hit enemies enough times. Now, if you don't want to use this weapon, or you're simply been farming it and can't get it, the Thorn Crimson Rector sword is not a bad replacement. It has the same strength requirement. Scales with strength as well, and it does bleed buildup instead of fire buildup, and bleed is also really strong in this game. So that is a good alternative, again, that you can find early. So feel free to use either of those two swords. And for my shield, I'm using the Hollowed Knight shield. This can be any shield that you want, really. You're going to have tons of strength, so you're going to be able to meet requirements for a lot of shields. It really comes down to weight. How much weight do you want on your shield versus how much, you want your armor to protect you. So it's really up to you. You could use a much better shield if you want, but you absolutely want to use a shield for this build. And the reason for that is because even though we're predominantly attacking with the Proselyte sword or the Thorn Crimson Rector sword the whole time, that shield is going to work as a medium to use rune slots, right? Like you're going to get rune slots from that shield that you can apply things to that can benefit your build. So even though it's going to take some weight, those rune slots are more than worth it. And for my ranged weapon, I am using the Trapper crossbow. I really love this. It's not super far into the game, drops from the Trapper enemies, has high strength requirement. We're going a strength build, so that's not a problem for us. Has very good strength scaling, and also has burn buildup, not unlike the Proselyte sword. So, if you hit something with a Trapper crossbow bolt and then attack, it's going to be more likely to be set on fire. And it also has higher attack power with fire than Holy or Wither. So if you're, trying to use like Cinder bolts, which we use in this build, something like that, it's going to be much more effective with those than maybe some other crossbows. And for bolts for this build, obviously you're going to use whatever you can get your hands on early on, but here I have weighted bolts, Cinder bolts, and Radiant bolts. We predominantly use Cinder bolts for this build because the crossbow itself works better with Cinder, and also the burn buildup from the bolts synergizes very nicely with the Proselyte sword. These bolts also hit like a truck. They have very high attack power, so you're going to get a lot of damage per shot. And then when it comes to the armor that you're going to use for this build, it doesn't really matter so much what your armor is. It's going to be kind of pushing you right up to the weight limit of being in that medium encumbrance, so you can still medium roll. Whatever you can get protection-wise that keeps you just under heavy. Depending on like what shield and what sword you're using, they might have a little bit different weight. But you can really pick whatever you want. Like I just kind of went for something that looked knightly. But like protection is a big part of this build, but it's not like the focus. So use whatever you want. If you're using a really heavy shield, use some lighter armor. If you're using a light shield, use some heavier armor. So then for my rings for this build, I'm using Crossbowman's Ring and Lucent Sword Ring. Crossbowman's Ring reduces the ammo cost of your bolts by 1. So instead of all of these bolts that I'm using that normally cost 3 ammo, they're only going to cost 2, which is really great because we have a lot of ammo with this build, and it's going to make it go a lot further. It's basically like a 50% increase in ammo by slotting this one ring, and since we hit really hard with our crossbow, that's really good for this build. And then we come to the Lucent Sword Ring, which is one that takes you quite a ways into the game before you can get, but what I really like about this is that it adds physical damage when you're at full or almost full health. And this applies to both your ranged and melee attacks, so you're going to get something out of this from both, which is great. And then for our pendant, I'm using Warrior's Claw, which increases your physical damage and physical defense. This is just really nice for this build. Even though your sword has some fire damage and you tend to use some Cinder arrows with this build, you still deal a decent amount of physical damage. So this will boost both your range and melee damage. And if you happen to use like the Thorn Crimson Rector sword, this will be even better for you because you're going to have exclusively physical damage on your melee. And also getting that extra physical defense just makes us tankier, which is really nice. So the general strategy I apply with this build is basically just using my crossbow to pick off anything that's like dangerous at range, picking off range enemies, or even, taking down like a really hard to kill enemy or softening them up to like a third health before engaging them in melee. So I don't use all of my crossbow bolts, but I'm like not having to fight them in melee the whole time. And this is really, really effective with this build. So you're kind of hopping back and forth between ranged and melee, not unlike the Black Feather Archer build I did, except that you're not playing like an agility-based build here. You're playing a strength-based build. Your crossbow is more secondary, whereas that build, the bow, is more primary. So even though you're doing things with this build to like boost your ranged effectiveness, your ranged is not like your primary means of dealing damage. It's more of a secondary thing, although it comes in handy all the time. And for the runes that we use for this build, on our sword, we're basically focusing on anything that boosts our damage. You want increased physical damage, increased fire damage, anything that's going to increase your damage more with your attacks you want on your sword. And then for shield here, I have increased ammunition because we really can't have enough ammo with this build. I also have increased stamina regeneration. You really use a lot of stamina with a longsword, so, you know, going through stamina can be a problem for this build. And by increasing your stamina regeneration, you know, you make that less of a problem, so that's really nice to have on your shield. Stat-wise, this build is level 85, but obviously you can play this build much earlier than that. Most of the equipment for this build can be got quite early on in the game, with the exception of probably the accessories, which take a little bit longer to get. And you can fill in other things in the meantime, because they're not like the backbone of this build, although the crossbowman's ring is really, really effective. You know, they're not like the only thing that makes this build work. So here I have 45 strength, 10 agility, 31 endurance, 32 vitality, 12 radiance, and 8 inferno. And the radiance is really there just because I started as a Dark Crusader with this class, and you start with 11, and I put 1 point in there. At one point I wasn't sure which direction I was going to go. But you really don't need any radiance, or inferno, or agility for this. So, like, if you were playing an optimum build, you would pick a class that has 8 agility, 8 radiance, and 8 inferno, and had, like, all strength, endurance, and vitality, because that's all you really want for this build. Strength, endurance, and vitality. And you probably want somewhere around 30 endurance and 30 vitality at this point of the game, with everything else in strength to just maximize your damage. Earlier on in the game, as you're putting this build together, you're going to focus more on endurance and vitality rather than strength. You'll probably get your strength up to 19 to use the weapon, and then focus on endurance and vitality so that you're not dying in a couple hits. And also, as you increase your endurance and vitality, you increase your ammo count, so that's going to help give you more crossbow bolts as well. So that wraps up my Lord of Cinder build. I hope you guys found this helpful. This is a really easy build to use in my opinion. It has very good melee damage, it has very good range damage. The synergy between crossbows and strength weapons is really, really nice, particularly since we're using a crossbow that has only strength scaling and a weapon that only has strength scaling. And also the nice synergy between the weapon having fire damage and burn buildup, and the crossbow having burn buildup, and cinder arrows having burn buildup. All works very, very nicely for this build. I think I'm going to keep going with some more build guides for Lords of the Fallen. If you guys are enjoying those, let me know. And also, if you guys have things you want to see, let me know in the comments below.